Hey everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here. Sorry the show's a bit late. I think I was a little bit burned out on the World Championship. And in part to kind of rectify that, we're going to look at a game that displays what we really didn't see an awful lot of in the World Championship, and that's taking a position where there's just a very small advantage and playing it out. What a concept. So there were numerous games where, while the position was probably roughly equal or just a little bit better for one side or the other, the players just kind of gave up. They just felt, all right, I've pushed enough for the day, or I achieved what I wanted to achieve out of this game, and I'll just try again tomorrow. But the thing is, these opportunities don't really grow on trees. I mean, Gelfand worked for years and years and years, finally made it to a World Championship match, got all the way to a tiebreak, even dominated the tiebreak in terms of the expected results of several of those games, and lost. I mean, all those years of work, all that effort, and certainly not for nothing. I mean, he's improved his place in the history of the game considerably and earned a nice payday too. But still, from a competitive standpoint, I mean, so close, and now he's got to push the rock back up the mountain all over again. So. And the other thing I was going to say is that in that match, whenever those players did push, very often there were half points gained and lost. I mean, neither of these guys, they both defended really very well, but not infallibly. I mean, they both made mistakes. And so it's worth pushing. And so that's what we're going to see in this game today. From the course tournament in Vikonsay back in 2008, white was Magnus Carlsen, one of the great technical players of our day, or really of any day. And black is the very strong Ukrainian grandmaster Pavel Ilyanov, who I believe was one of Gelfand's seconds. Ilyanov is a Grunfeld specialist, and indeed we're going to see that in the game we're going to look at now. And of course we saw that Gelfand trotted out the Grunfeld in the match. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and start. And as I said, it's a Grunfeld, and Carlsen plays this rather positional line here. And then not this this gambit line with e3, but queen a4 check. So he regains the pawn, but black gets very nice development. So there's no real stress on black. White doesn't get a big pawn center, and indeed it's a very safe position. Yeah, black can also go like this. Okay, we'll see this variation like this. Okay, so this is the game. Here, black has a big choice between c5, which was played by Ilyanov, and knight to c6. And I'll say a little bit about both. In the Grunfeld repertoire books, Delchev and Agrest recommend knight to c6, while Avrukh recommends c5. And they're both fine. I mean, they're both, I think, good enough for equality, or something very, very close to equality. All right, well, let's start with a quick look at knight c6. So rook h to d1, knight a5, queen b4, and here rook f to e8 is another important move that's still certainly played. But the Delchev and Agrest book recommends e6, which is fine. Simply another way of dealing with the threat. So of course, by playing rook f to e8, you may be hinting that you'd like to play e5 at some moment. Anyway, after e6, rook a to c1, rook f to c8, and that's another point to e6, c4, and now a key move, c5. And this looks very strange because obviously it's giving away a pawn, and even if it weren't, b takes c5 would hang the knight on a5. But we're going to see this kind of sacrifice pretty regularly in what follows. And it's indeed a typical Grunfeld motif, because if white ends up taking on b6 and black plays a takes b6, yes, white has won a pawn, but the pawn's on c4 and a2, so after all of this gobblage has transpired, so these guys on c4 and a2 are just as weak as the pawn on b6, and black is doing fine. So, for example, if d takes c5, queen c7, maybe queen to b7 might be at least as good. But okay, queen c7, cb, ab, and here black has full compensation for the material. I think white is supposed to play, or should play bishop to g3 here. But if, for instance, king to f1, Delchev and Agrest mentioned bishop f8 and say that black is better. That may be correct, but knight takes c4, simple move, looks like it's even better. So black, I think, has an edge at this point. So d takes c5 gets nowhere. All right, queen to b5. This is the main move here. Queen to b7, d5. And here we have another typical Grunfeld motif in action, or we could say anti-Grunfeld motif since it's playing from white's point of view. And that's the march of the d-pawn. So in Rowson's old book, which is a bit corny at times but still very good, he refers to this as, I think, Delroy. So here comes Delroy marching up the board. So takes, and now black has a choice. One thing he can play, basically he can either blockade this pawn immediately, or he can go for his own counterplay with the c pawn. So the immediate blockading strategy is rook c7 and then rook to d7, and then Delchev and Agreste give rook to e8 and say that this is solid and fine for black, but maybe they're underestimating e5 somewhat. If you take with the bishop, then you're maybe committing a little bit of semi-suicide on the dark squares. Rook takes e5 is actually pretty interesting, but in any event, it seems like white maybe has a very, very small pull, but nothing serious. Okay, the alternative, and this not only has is also sanctioned by those guys, but was also played earlier this year by Ray Robson against Kirilla. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, in a tournament in Richardson, I think that's Texas, as I said, in 2012. So the game continued d6, rook c5, and here I think Delchev and Agreste just give queen a4, f6. So that book came out in 11. This game obviously was played later than that. So Kirilla played queen to b1. Here queen to d7 would be good for equality, but so is f6. And now queen d7, it's still equal. And here white just blunders. He starts making bad moves and then blunders. So he plays e4, which is not very good. Rook e8, king f1, f5. And the problem is that after e5, for instance, black can play bishop h6, and f4 possibilities are kind of lurking about. The white pieces are really pretty clumsy, and while the pawns look good in the center, they're pretty firmly blockaded. In the game, Kirilla played e takes f5, which should make his bishop on g3 happy, but there's a really big problem with this, and you might want to see if you can spot it for yourself. So e takes f5 is positionally very well motivated. Alas, though, it's a stone-cold blunder. Rook b5, goodbye queen. Queen c2, rook b2, and no more moves for the queen. So, game over. Well, it should have been game over. For no obvious reason, white continued for another 15 moves, probably just extremely angry with himself, but he was just down a queen for a rook and had no chance. All right, so of course that wasn't forced, and back here the position is still just about equal, but it's tricky. Got to be careful. Yep. Okay, so yeah, he missed the threat with f5. It wasn't just to win the pawn, but it was to clear the diagonal, so rook b5, rook b2 would be there. Okay, well anyway, all of that was about knight to c6. In our game, Elyanov played c5, which is recommended by Avrukh. So another excellent book. Both were actually very good. Well, Avrukh's 2-volume series, or the 1-volume book by Chess Stars from Delchev and Agreste. And I really like their book. It's in fact very good. So you can get either one, or either the pair from Avrukh or the one by the other guys, and it's worth your money if you're a Grunfeld player. Anyway, here again there's choices. So d takes c5 is the move in the game, but rook h to d1 is also important. Okay, here everyone seems to recommend knight to c6, including actually Delchev and Agreste think that this line is not as good, but we'll address that in a minute. I'm wondering why c takes d4 is not played more often. It seems to me that this is just fine for black. I mean, white can play queen to b5, but it seems to me that black is equal. But maybe the idea is just to be a little bit more combative. You can always play c takes d4. Anyway, well, you can't always, because now white plays dc. Now here, Theory and Delchev and Agreste think that white has a little pull after queen c8, rook a to b1, takes, and queen c4. And this kind of transformation often happens. If black ends up taking back on c5 rather than successfully making the pawn sack work, then this kind of structure is really pretty unpleasant for him because, he has no targets while the c5 pawn is a target. the pawn on c3 is great. I mean, it's mildly weak, but what it really does well is it restricts both of black's minor pieces. So white has a very nice pull here. For instance, Delchev and Agreste continue like this. So here, white has won a pawn. Although, I think this position is equal. So they stop here, and they note that black can play this. But it looks like this position is probably about equal for black. So I don't know. It seems to me that this is reasonable for black as well. Anyway, I still will recommend what Avrukh does, and I had come up with this move on my own too. So queen to f5. So now Avrukh gives a couple of main variations. So if c takes b6, ab, king f1, scurrying away, queen c5, hitting the c3 pawn, a4, just rook f to c8, no rush, knight d4, e6, again, just patient, rook a to b1, knight e5, queen b6, queen c3. And this is equal because the a4 pawn, is not going to be able to survive in the long term. Or it's not even a very long term at that. If rook a1, for instance, black can play queen c4 check, and then play rook takes on a4. So the pawn is a goner. Alright, so back here, instead of c takes b6, white could also try rook to d5, attempting to really maintain control rather than immediately aiming to consolidate the extra pawn. But now queen to e4, okay, cb, ab. If, well, you can't play queen b6 because the rook is hanging, so rook a to d1, e6, rook d7, knight a5. And again, white's got a decision to make. So Avrukh just mentions queen to b4, but we should point out that the reason black is not worried about queen takes b6 is queen to c4 check. So if king e1, bishop c3 is unpleasant, while if rook went to d3, then after knight to c6, the a2 pawn is hanging, and rook f to b8 is an even bigger deal. That may just end up winning the queen. Even if it doesn't, that's two rooks that are going to come flying into the game. So white is pretty close to losing at this point. Certainly, it doesn't win the queen because rook b7, but still he's under a lot of pressure here, and white is close to lost at this point. So queen to b4 is correct, and now black can either play knight c4, which seems to end up as a repetition after king f1, rook a4, queen b3, rook a3, and so on, queen b4, rook a4. Of course, white can't take the rook here because knight takes e3 check, and queen takes a4. Okay, if black needs to play for a win, or wants to play for a win, then queen to c4 check is not a repetition and allows the game to continue. And black is fine here too. But objectively, white should hold this without any trouble, even if he's a little bit lower rated. Anyway, so that was after king e2. So we looked at knight c6. Black seems to be fine there, as in the Kirilla-Robson game. There's c5, and then we looked at rook h to d1, which was Delchev and Agreste's recommendation. We saw that black is fine there. And now let's look at the game. So d takes c5. Of course, this is also covered by Avrukh. Knight a6. And the engine's like black here, and black has generally scored pretty reasonably in the databases. All right, well, let's first of all begin with the same question, our now thematic question. Why not c takes b6? Well, no one has played this, and I think rightly so. After knight to c5, this is already looking like a nasty initiative brewing for black. So queen c4, a b6, rook h to d1, so getting ready to scamper out, and then queen to b7. And yeah, I mean, black's still got some pressure. Rook to a4 might end up being embarrassing in some variations. So black is, in fact, clearly better at this point. Even e6 with some ideas like rook a4, queen b5, maybe bring the second rook over to a5, or if you can. So also just knight to e4 is a very simple and nice idea. So white really has a lot of tactical liabilities here, and all this for just one pawn. So it's correct for white to play rook h to d1, preparing to castle by hand. Now, at this point, black played queen to b7, which is perhaps inaccurate. It seems like it's inaccurate, as white can liquidate his bad pawn with c6, queen c6, bishop e7. Now, this is the game. We'll come back to it. This isn't really all that terrible either. So it's not clear that queen b7 is really all that bad, but it seems as if queen to c7 may be slightly more accurate. Now, white is, again, not really best served taking on b6. So if c takes b6, a b6, black seems not to have any difficulties here. So just to give you some theory. Okay, if bishop to g3, black can just take on c3. There seems to be nothing really wrong with this. Takes, rook a to c1, and a draw was agreed in the game of Ibrahimov against Volzhin in Ubeda in 1996. In another game, Lanchava against Gustafsson, despite being 200 points higher rated, Gustafsson was able to get nothing with queen c6. So king f1, knight c5, queen d5, takes, bishop c3, rook c1, rook c2. So, I mean, black is fine, but isn't winning this either. All right. So the one thing we can say about this, practically speaking, is that if you're white and you're playing a high-rated player, you might want to try this just as a very solid approach. So it is a very reliable line. Well, here's a game, though, where it proves not terribly reliable. A4 was chosen by Joel Lautier against Vasily Ivanchuk in Terrassa in 1991. And maybe so far white is doing, well, still roughly equal, but he quickly goes downhill. So knight to d2 leaves him slightly worse here. Now I'd say he's clearly worse, and now he's just about losing. The problem is his queen's got nowhere safe to go. Like if you go to b1, knight takes c3. If you go to b3, knight c5, and the rooks are just in trouble. Well, what do I say? Queen b1, you just play queen takes c4. Sorry. So yeah, I mean all kinds of tactical liabilities. The rooks, the knight, it's bad. So Lautier played knight to d6. Now knight takes c3. Still more tricks, hitting the rook. Well, hitting both rooks. And if rook takes a5, b takes a5, hits the queen too. So he played rook a to c1, rook c5, and now another problem, right? Well, actually, yeah, knight takes rook and knight to a2 maybe are threatened. So he tried rook to d3, and now knight to e4. And Lautier had decided he had his fill of tactical combinations for the day and gave up. I think the point would be that if rook takes c5, you can interpolate knight takes g3 check and then play b takes, and that should win. Or even maybe rook a1 check first. But all of these are going to leave black up a considerable amount of material. All right, so black is doing fine after queen c7. That seems to be the theoretical upshot. All right, so we now leave the realm of theory almost behind, and now we're going to enjoy Carlsen's performance as a technical matter. So there's an earlier game between Efstratios Grivas and Peter Leko from Dortmund in '92, when Leko was still a wee lad, but a very strong wee lad. And Leko played rook a to d8 against his GM opponent, although Grivas might not have been a GM yet. He was probably pretty close, though. Anyway, in that game, white was able to consolidate his extra pawn, although he didn't manage to win. Leko just held on like a barnacle on the side of a ship, and even though his position here is fairly bad, I mean, he's just down a pawn for nothing. He had to work for another 48 moves, but he reeled in the half a point. So good job by Leko, but not something that we want to emulate. So queen takes c3, which was a new move, and I'm not sure if it's had any followers, because I think queen to b7 is probably out of business. So I think I did mention, right? So I want to make sure. The difference between queen b7 and queen c7 is that if white plays c6 here, black plays knight c5, rather than taking the pawn on c6. Okay, so queen b7, so we already did all this. And here Elyanov played queen takes c3, takes, rook a to c1. All right, well, this position may seem just completely innocuous. I mean, white's development's a little nicer, but it's not much. And besides that, material's even, and black has this little queenside majority. And those of you who play the Grunfeld know that this majority is often far more meaningful than white's central majority, whether it's you add a white d pawn here and a black pawn here or something like that, or here without the d pawn and e pawn. White's majority is going to take forever to get moving, while you can see black playing b5, b4, move the knight, a5, b4, and so on. Well, sometimes that's true, but here really white is a little bit better. His rooks are in the central files first, and his minor pieces are all a bit better placed than black. So all of this put together, and his king is centralized as well. So all of this does mean that he's got an edge. Now, rook a to c8 is a very natural and obvious move, but the problem is rook to d7. So that's no good. But Elyonov played bishop to b4, which really makes quite a bit of sense. Now, if bishop c4, if bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, rook c4 is a very interesting idea. And in case of something like knight to a6, which seems to be forced, then knight to d4, and white keeps some chances for an edge. I mean, it's a little tough for black to completely unravel here. However, black has, I think, the capture on a2. It looks as if this has been prevented by putting the rook on c4, so you play rook to d2, but the idea is simply b5. And if the rook goes sideways, then there's knight to c3 check. If it moves vertically, there's knight to b4. And this position is equal. So black is all right here after bishop takes b4. So Carlsen correctly keeps pieces on the board. Bishop to b2. All right, black plays bishop f8 and prepares, in some cases, to just neutralize the white bishop. But really the point is that he wants to play knight to c5, but if he does that here, then his bishop may get locked out on a5. White can play a3 or rook to c4 more likely, and the bishop is going to be just incredibly stupid over on a5. So that's why he plays bishop f8 first, to sidestep that. Okay, so now Carlsen plays knight to d4. Elyonov plays knight to c5. And again, it looks like black is okay. So he managed to avoid any white penetration with the rooks. The black knight has gotten to a good square. The bishop is decent on f8, where it looks on two different diagonals, or could transfer to the second diagonal. And it seems like, again, white doesn't really have very much here. And, well, he doesn't have very much, but he does have a little something. And what Carlsen does very, very well in this entire game is that he doesn't force the issue. So he just makes little improvements, just like Karpov used to do. You just make a bunch of small improvements, and in the long run, this has two effects. So first of all, if you make enough small improvements, if you accrue enough small advantages, it turns into a big advantage. And the other thing is that when your opponent is slightly worse in these positions, very often it's just extremely difficult and unpleasant to keep defending and defending and defending with no way to resolve it, right? I mean, one of the things in the Gelfand-Anand match, didn't happen every game, but what they were always trying to do was trying to find some way of just resolving the tension, not merely to create a position where it was more or less equal, but one where it's just a 0.0, 0.00 kind of game, where there's just nothing, where it's just obvious routine technique that I could draw against one of these guys. Well, Carlsen does a magnificent job of avoiding that, and that's what those guys didn't really seem to push enough to try to do. And the few times where they did, as I said, it often brought dividends. All right, well, enough of this kind of conceptual talk. What should white do at this point? Well, a very obvious move here is knight to b5. So this threatens to go to c7 and clears the d file for the rook and clears the bishop for that matter. It's diagonal too. And maybe, who knows, white could hope for something like knight c7, knight d5, knight f6. So there are a variety of things that this nasty knight could do. But black has a very good rejoinder. He can play rook a to c8. And now, okay, if knight takes a7, just rook to a8, that's problem solved and then some. So this is not a particularly talented idea. All right, but bishop to a3. This is more interesting because now we threaten, again, knight takes a7 because the knight can come back to b5 and protect the bishop. So here, rook a4. Nice fancy move here. And this time, in case of knight a7, rook a8, knight b5, black can just double rooks on the a file and really tie white down. So bishop takes c5 is interesting. bc, rook to d7. So again, it looks like white is making some real progress here. But if black keeps playing actively, I think he can hold the balance. Knight a7, rook b2, and now what? King d1, for instance, rook c to b8, rook c2. Rook just comes back, and now the knight is trapped. Not that it's going to be won, but because it's trapped, black can regain the pawn. and this is just equal. Okay, so I'm sure Carlsen looked at, if not exactly that line, then lines very, very similar to it, realized that black could hold the balance, and so looked for a way to improve his position instead, rather than trying to just force something where there's nothing there. And the move he played is a very good one. He plays g4. So this, it doesn't win or anything, but it's a very strong move. It prevents f5 from black. Not that f5, whether f5 is good or not is certainly a question, but it prevents it. The pawn may also end up coming to g5, where it further kind of locks down the black kingside pawn structure, and it may also be involved with some kind of more general pawn storm with h4, h5 at some point, or f2, f4, f5. So there are a variety of things that this move does, and best of all, it doesn't hurt a bit. So it's free space. Okay, well here I think Elyanov makes an inaccuracy. I would have preferred rook a to c8 or a6 to keep the knight off of b5. Now, in some cases this might slightly loosen black's queenside, and probably something along those lines was what Elyanov was afraid of. Maybe white plays rook to b1 at some point, induces b5, and then switches back to the c file. Maybe, but that's fairly long-winded, and black should have things he can do in the meantime too. Anyway, he played rook to e4, so he hits the pawn, but I'm not sure that the rook is really all that brilliantly placed. Okay, so king f3, and there are already ideas like just rook takes c5. So rook a to e8 protects the rook. Okay, h3 shores up the pawn. And now another move that black plays here is maybe not questionable, but it's one of those moves that can be very difficult to decide. At least I found this to be the case in tournament games. So I remember one game in particular. It wasn't f6, but it was one of these things where, okay, you want to push the pawn. Where the thought is this: if I don't push the pawn, my opponent can grab some more space, and how worrisome is that? What can you do with that extra space? On the other hand, if I push the pawn, then I'm kind of weakening my structure a little bit, and there, in the absence of really clear forcing variations, sometimes little decisions like that can just be really aggravating and difficult to work through. And I suspect f6 was just such a move. So its assets, its advantages, its pluses, its virtues are fairly clear. It closes the diagonal, it stops g5, it enables king f7. So those are all very good things. On the other, and it stops g5. But on the other hand, the pawn can become a target someday, and if white plays at some point h4 and g5, well, let's say, for instance, at some point white manages to play e4. So he moves the king, plays f3, plays e4, and then plays h4 and g5. Well, now white's going to have is going to be able to force it past e pawn. Okay, that'll clearly take some doing, but that's possible. And even without forcing the preliminary e4 first, this idea of h4 and g5 is a significant one, and it reopens that diagonal, and then there are various dark square weaknesses in black's position. So that's an issue, as well as the fact that pawn could be hanging, and it opens the 7th rank as well, and sometimes that can prove to be significant too. Okay, white played bishop to a3, hoping, well, we'll see. There are some lines where white will very much be inclined to take on c5. All right, black plays king f7, tightening up the structure there and just centralizing the king. And now another moment where Carlsen again goes for the squeeze rather than some kind of direct progress. So the direct progress approach is knight to c6. So we hit the pawn, we clear the file, so we're threatening not only something like knight takes a7, but also bishop c5, followed by rook to d7 check, trying to make something happen this way. Okay, on this, black should play rook to a4, hitting the bishop. So bishop c5, rook d7 check, king g8, rook a7. Yay, free pawn. Well, not quite. This loses it back. So knight b5, rook a2. And it's still a little bit better for white, but it's awfully hard to win. And one further point to bear in mind is that should white manage to win the black b pawn at the cost of exchanging the minor pieces, the 4-on-3 is probably going to be a draw as well, as long as maybe as long as black's rook controls the 7th rank, so he can keep his king on a decent square like f7 or g7. So if you can do that, I think this position, or that rook ending, would likely be a draw. Not 100% sure, but probably. And anyway, it's going to take some doing to actually win that beat pawn. So let's not count that just yet either. So Carlsen again realizes that may give him some edge, but nothing really too concrete. So he just improves his position, and rook to c2 is a very nice move. It does several things. So first of all, it prepares to double on either the c or the d files. Secondly, in lines like the one we just saw, so let's take a look at this again. Knight c6, rook a4, take, check here, takes, here, knight b5. If white's rook is on c2, there's no a pawn to collect. So that's another idea with rook to c2. So it just prepares that. Okay, so here black could try a couple of moves, and Elyanov made a very committal decision, and one that seems to have been inaccurate. It looks like it was an inaccuracy. Maybe not a fatal one, but somewhat serious nonetheless. So the move that's been suggested, and I think the engine likes it too, Michalchyshin and Stetsko, I guess, in their book on Carlsen, recommend this retreat, rook 4 to e7. And now, okay, if bishop takes c5, bc5, all right, if rook takes c5, then rook e3 check is just equal. The bishop on f8 takes the rook next. If knight to b3, rook c7, knight a5, this, I think, maybe favors white slightly. I think this is my variation, not theirs. And then if knight c6, rook c7, knight b4, rook c to c8, yeah, this I think is just equal. So yeah, this line is probably white's best shot within the bishop takes c5 complex. So yeah, that was my analysis there. So Michalchyshin gives knight b5, rook b7, and now h4 is a very interesting move. So again, another squeezing move with the idea of either playing h4, h5 or g4, g5 as play warrants. And perhaps white has a slight edge here. But there are a couple other possibilities that he doesn't mention that are interesting. So one is knight to d6 check. So takes. Now we're threatening to take the knight. So rook c7, takes, rook c4. And this ending is probably still a draw. It's actually kind of similar to an endgame that can arise in the Tarish Queen's Gambit, but here black has a little bit better structure than he does there. And I think that's enough to hold without too much trouble. Probably rook to e6 would be simplest. Another idea, instead of Michalchyshin's h4 suggestion, is rook c to d2, threatening to take and then check on d7. So a6 forces this, and white probably has a small edge here, but again, nothing too serious. So this would have been a playable line for black, or again, maybe going to the h4 idea, but essentially nothing really bad is happening. White will continue to squeeze, but there's nothing concrete yet. Okay, Elyanov played knight to a6, and it makes sense. I mean, black's bishop is pretty passive, and he has to worry about the f6 spot, the f6 pawn being getting in trouble. So it makes sense from that standpoint, but it lets white penetrate here, and that proves more serious. So takes and takes, and now Carlsen has a choice. So rook c6 is what he played, and this goes, I think, unremarked upon by Michalchyshin as well, but knight c6 actually looks pretty good. Threatening, of course, just to take the pawn. Knight to b4 seems to be the best reaction. I mean, a move like rook a8 is ridiculous. White plays rook to d7, and even if it weren't winning a pawn, it's just so unbelievably passive. I mean, you just can't play a move like rook to a8. You got to look for counterplay. So knight b4, takes, rook d7, rook e7, takes, check, and now king e6. Of course, rook h7 is not so good because of rook a4. So rook a7 is the key move. And now, certainly white has good winning chances here. Maybe h5 is reasonable, hoping to swap some pawns with hg. Of course, white can trade this way. But for the moment, this is all right for black. I mean, he's not going to lose a second pawn, because if white goes for the h pawn, black can either play h4 or just rook a4 and swap it off to get the outside passer. Probably h4 would be more reliable. But at any rate, whether black plays h5 or not, white is just up a pawn, and as long as the queenside pawns are alive, he's got fair winning chances. And even with, well, I should say, even if the queenside pawns leave, depending on the configuration of the kingside pawns and how active or inactive black's king is, white might still have very good winning chances. So I think knight to c6 was, in fact, not a bad option at all. But Carlsen, again, prefers to keep squeezing. I don't know if it's better, but it's a very, very effective strategy psychologically. Okay, Ilyanov played king to g7. And now another possibility besides Carlsen's move. So Carlsen plays knight to b5. But you might be tempted by a4, or at least this caught my attention here, with the idea of a5. So a little minority attack, trying to win a pawn over on the queen side. Why not? Well, okay, rook 4 to e7, a5, knight to b4, rook d6, b takes a5. Okay, so now white starts going for a pawns, but he's only getting one. It's not going to be easy to win this, and again, even if he does win it, black is ideally set up for that 4-on-3 ending, and I think we'll manage to draw this. So Carlsen is once again right to just keep squeezing without commitments. So knight to b5, rook 4 to e7, rook d to d6. You notice white just keeps creeping forward, creeping forward. Well, I think Ilyanov should have gone passive here with rook to f7. It's unpleasant, but it seems that what he did was worse. So this at least keeps the material, and probably white would just go back to d4, threatening knight to d6. And the upshot would be that he gained rook to d4 for free, because we started off here with the rook on d1, and so here he's getting it to d4 for free if black plays a rook f to e7 again. And then rook a4 can be played. So white definitely still has an edge at this point. So these two threats in play. Okay, so in the game though, Ilyanov played knight to c5. So it's a little tactical trick, and it makes sense. I mean, he gets the knight to a better square. Rook takes f6 is impossible because of knight to d7. The point being that after the rook moves from f6, there's knight to e5 check, and then this guy drops. But Carlsen plays knight to c7, so this is a good move and avoids any problems. Black plays rook f8, defending. And again, Carlsen makes a very patient move here. He plays h4. But I'm really not sure about rook takes c5. I mean, this looks like a very legitimate winning try. So it's really remarkable that Carlsen just keeps resisting the temptation to go for these cash outs. Okay, let's have a look. bc, knight check, takes, and now, all right, what does black do? So the threat, there are two threats. One is to play, the main threat is to play rook to c6, and if rook to c8, then there's rook e7 check. So you might also consider playing rook f7. Which is the right way to go? I think the answer is rook c8. If you play rook f7, if there were no a pawns, I believe this is a draw. Maybe not, definitely not a trivial draw, but it should be a draw if I'm not mistaken. However, with the a pawns, it makes a difference, because one idea for white is, for instance, to round up the pawn and just shove this guy here and play for something like that. So this kind of idea, and combining that with that sort of threat with threats on the king side, just advancing the pawns, grabbing space, and so on, that is going to tie black's defenses too thin. So I'm sure that white is winning in this ending. So rook c8 is correct. Okay, check. And now, again, we've got a choice. Should the king come up and try to be active, or go back? So the king is safer on g8 than it is on h6, but it's also more passive. Well, let's look at both. So if king h6, then rook a7, c4, and then the king should come back. Remember, the king is not as strong a piece as the rook, and as a general rule, you want to defend with the weakest possible piece that you can. Don't use a rook to do a job a weaker piece can do. So rook to b8, a4, check, king here, c3, rook c7, c2, h4. So if the black king were somewhere sane, this would be okay probably for him, but it is a little exposed there. For instance, king f4, e4, and the threat is to play g5 check, takes, and then rook h7 mate. So rook a7 is kind of a nifty resource here. Rook c2, g5 check. And here, two interesting possibilities. All right, if king f5, king g7, e5, takes here. Again, funny, the king coming up here, but it seems to be okay. f4. And now white's got this big herd of pawns, but black can pick them off. So there goes one of them, there goes two of them, there goes three of them, and this is a draw. So it's if the white rook were on a better square, I think almost any other square on the chessboard, it would be a win for white. But here, black draws by a tempo. So going back here, instead of king f5, maybe better is hg5, fg5, king e5, king g7, king d4, rook a3. And I'm not sure at all how to assess this. I mean, obviously white's better, but is this a win? I really don't know. Black could consider harassing the g-pawn, but if he does that, then white's pawn could start moving awfully fast. So on the other hand, I don't know if black can defend by just sort of going for side checks and trying to impede the e-pawn. So white clearly has very good winning chances here. Whether it's a win or not, I didn't spend the time to really try to figure it out to a degree of certainty. All right, but it was enough for me to be nervous and to decide to check out king to g8. So here, rook a7, c4, king e2, rook b8, e4, check, king e3. And now, again, maybe h5. So it's double-edged playing like that. I mean, you are weakening your structure with black, but on the other hand, you do two things. So you trade pawns, and you weaken the h3 pawn, and perhaps you have a chance to get some counterplay. I mean, if you can win the h3 pawn while white is winning something else, then the h pawn will be passed and could prove a slight nuisance in some cases. So takes, h4, getting out of the way of any rook b3 skewers, so that way white can play a4. So c3, rook a5, king g7. Of course, if rook h5, then rook a2. So a4, rook b4, rook c5. And this, I think, black can hold. Maybe not, won't be tremendously pleasant, but I think black is drawing this. I won't bet my life on it, but probably. But again, maybe some deep investigation will prove otherwise. I do feel a little bit nervous for black, I mean, with the pawn split like that. But, yes, the h-pawn does make me worried a bit. Anyway, Carlsen rejected this, so he played h4. So again, just squeezing. So he has the option of playing for h5 or g5, and black really just has to sit and wait. I mean, he can't do anything. Rook f to f7, knight to d5, rook to d7. So here we have a trade of pieces, but it doesn't really liberate black. One key variation now, or for you to answer if you want, should black play rook takes d7 or knight takes d7? So take your time, try to figure out what the right defense is. Neither guarantees a draw necessarily, but one move keeps the game going, the other one is a serious error. Okay, well, the move that black would really like to play is rook takes d7. And here's the idea. Knight f6, otherwise, what has white got? In fact, then black is activating his own rook and might have some chances. So rook f7, g5, and now knight to d7, threatening not only to take on f6, but also threatening to play knight e5 check. So white comes up, king e4, takes. Okay, so now we have a king and pawn ending with even pawns, but lots of imbalances. White's got a passed e-pawn, black has a possible outside passed pawn, which is often a tremendous weapon, and black can go for something like h5 and g5 or g5, going for this outside passed pawn over on the king side too. So it's pretty hard to assess, I mean, at a glance. You have to just calculate this out. And, what should white do at this point? So you might want to try to calculate this if you can. Well, it looks as if king to d5 is winning. And I'm just going to give one variation, basically. If black plays passively with king to e7, then white just plays king c6, king b7, and raids the pawns over there. or maybe plays, yeah, and make sure to play f4 in case black plays h5. So for instance, here you do it so you don't have to worry about g5. But the key variation is g5. Well, how about this? You know, isn't this pretty good? And maybe white can play h5, but surprisingly, he can play hg, king g5. And now white wins with king e6. Kind of a remarkable move. I mean, it looks as if black could even be winning here, because if the white king starts running back to the corner, you know, you play king e4, then, okay, black plays b5, b4, a5, a4, b3, and so on. And just stretches the white king out. You know, he can't keep both h1 and a1 or b1 protected at the same time. And you would think, okay, well, if that doesn't work, then at least we should start pushing our pawns, e4 or f4, something like that. But no, white plays king to e6. But this is really a great move. h5, f4 check. Okay, now all the retreats are bad. If you go to g6, then f5 check gives white an extra tempo, and he's going to queen in plenty of time for that queen to stop black's h-pawn. If h6, then f8 queen is going to come with check. King h4 blocks the pawn, so that leaves king g4. f5, h4, and both sides queen. And now white has several ways, unfortunately for black, to force the trade of queens, one of which is queen and g7 check. The king can't go to f3, alas, because of the skewer on the long diagonal. So king h3 is completely forced, check, and then white promotes. So life is cruel sometimes. I mean, rook takes d7 here doesn't work because of that variation. Too bad. So he had to play knight takes d7. All right, and the funny thing is, even though we had this exchange, black is still not liberated. Now, he's got a threat though. So white plays king g3, knight c5, and now just f3. So he keeps his grip, keeps improving his position. And notice that black just never gets out of this bind. I mean, he's just stewing permanently in his own juices, going absolutely nowhere. So e4 is controlled. Black is tied down by the f-pawn. The black queen side majority can't move anywhere. If he pushes the b-pawn, the knight hangs. If he pushes the a-pawn, the b-pawn hangs. Can't move his king because the f-pawn hangs. I mean, it's just awful. It's Karpovian or Petrosianic, what's happening to him. And, as very often happened with Petrosian and Karpov's opponents, at a certain moment, they got just sick of defending and being able to do nothing, and would push a pawn, would try to lash out, and this would just end up speeding their collapse. So here, Ulyanov played h6, and this, it loosens his structure, it weakens it. So Carlsen played knight to f4, and now the idea is to play for h5. And black doesn't want to play g takes h5 when white can take with the knight. And if he plays g5, then he's weakening g6 and f5 and a whole bunch of light squares. So this is pretty miserable. So he plays g5, trying to preempt that. Knight h5 check. The problem is the black king has to come to g6, otherwise the f-pawn drops. And now f4. So this is really unpleasant too. So now the threat is just f5 check and then taking on f6. Well, here black had one last chance to put up some resistance, although I think he's probably losing anyway. So that was knight to e4 check, king f3, and then rook to e7. So this is completely forced. The only way, I think, to safeguard the f-pawn. Now, one idea from here is kind of funny. Rook to e6. I don't know that white has to play this, but it's interesting. So takes is forced, f5, king h6, or h7 is going to come to the same thing. But, of course, not king f7, because then you lose the rook with check, and then the knight. So king h6 is forced, or equal forced. Okay, f e6, knight e6, knight f6, and then king g6. Okay, so that would have happened whether the king was on h7 or h6. Okay, so now knight e4, knight to b5, king e2, knight c7. I mean, the king can't approach the e-pawn, so he's got to force it to advance. And I think white is winning this ending. So I'm not 100% sure, but I'm fairly sure. I mean, certainly white has tremendous winning chances here. If there's a draw, it's going to require something, from a study at some point. Okay, still there was some work to be done there. In the game, Ulyanov played g takes f4 check. That was the last move of the time control, and now the control has been made, but there's no doubt any longer about the assessment. White is simply winning, because here knight e4 check followed by rook to e7, excuse me, doesn't work because of f5 check and then king f4. And here black is in Zugzwang. If he moves the knight, he loses the f pawn. If he moves the rook, he either excuse me, he either loses the knight, or if he goes back, then there's rook to c7 check and he loses the a pawn. So moving the knight loses the f pawn, moving the king loses the f pawn, moving the rook loses the knight or the a pawn, moving the a pawn loses the b pawn, and that leaves moving the b pawn. But then white maybe plays something like rook a6 and just reestablishes the Zugzwang, or maybe plays a3 and then rook a6. So at this point, oh, and there's also rook e6. Actually, that's even worse for black because there's a threat. So he doesn't even have to just wait. Rook e6 will win material. So Elyanov played king to h7 as there was just nothing to be done for that f pawn. But once again, so you got to love this. Again, oh, sorry, let me correct myself. The f pawn was not lost yet because knight f6, rook f6, knight e4 check. So f5 is not a threat from black, but Carlsen doesn't want to allow it in any case. So f5 takes that away. King g8, king f3. Okay, so now, of course, he's threatening the f pawn. Elyanov defends it and threatens the fork on e5. So king e4, squeezing a bit more. Elyanov plays king f8, rook c8 check, king e7, and now white could play rook h8 and just start harvesting, but again, he keeps this sadistic Karpovian, Petrosianic squeeze going on here. So the black king doesn't even get to go to d6. I mean, it's amazing. I know that, I think, yeah, I mean, there are at least a couple of times where black pieces got on white side of the board, but very, very few occasions. And in fact, here, black doesn't even control a single square on white side of the board. All right, well, after b5 he does, but now rook to h8. Knight b6 check, king c6, knight c4, and again, I like this. So he could take, I think, well, if he takes, then he's got to route knight e5 and then knight g4. So rook a8 doesn't even allow that. Knight e5 check, king c5. And here, if knight takes g4, then rook a7, rook f7, king b5, and the a pawn is going to be an insuperable difficulty for black to overcome. So I guess I can show this. Why not? So here, king f8, take, take, take. And as you probably know, a rook pawn, in other words, the a pawn or the h pawn, is just about invariably the worst possible pawn for a knight to deal with. So it's the knight's mortal enemy, you might say, in an endgame, in a knight and pawn ending. So white is just winning very easily here. So Elyanov played knight to d7 check again, king b5, king d6. So this is what passes for activity in black's position, but even this doesn't really get anywhere. So rook a7, pinning the knight, rook f8, king b4. So that way, in case of checks, the king can go to c3 and avoid checks by the black knight. So knight c5, king c4. So another little accurate squeezing move. And here, 2 pawns down, still with absolutely no activity, and still with weak pawns remaining. Elyanov gave up. So really a great game by Carlsen, and very, very instructive. Not only for, let's say, the specific details of the technique, but the kind of the philosophy of the thing. So again, very patient. This idea: don't hurry. Let your opponent kind of help you out by creating weaknesses all by himself. Don't be in a rush to cash in. It's more important to keep control. So Carlsen did all of those things and really won just a model game. So this, and again, it's also useful from the standpoint of just being a fighter. I mean, you see a game like this and you realize that certainly there are drawn positions in chess. There are games that are and should be drawn, but there's an awful lot more fight in a position than most of us, and I would say including most grandmasters, seem to give positions credit for having. And Elyanov is a great grandmaster. At this point, he was almost 2,700. I think within the year, he got as high as something like 2760. So this is a great player, and yet, I mean, he was just, you know, ground down inexorably by Carlsen's superior technique. So be inspired by this. It doesn't mean that you should, you know, look to play like Karpov if your style is more aggressive or anything like that. But just because a position isn't, let's say, what you want when you're putting on your Mikhail Tal hat, you know, Tal would grind out players too. So, you know, you can see here that it can be done even against a fantastic player. I mean, small advantages can accrue and become decisive advantages. Okay, so that's all that I think I need to say about this game. So thanks a lot. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next week. Bye-bye.